Hello, welcome back to Black Book Stacks. I am your host, Hoshonda Sanders. Thank you so much for your likes, shares, and subscribes. They mean so much to me. Really excited to talk to you about my latest finished book, which is Zora Neale Hurston's Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick. So, a little backstory before I go into this. I'm a huge fan of Zora Neale Hurston. Of course, Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is probably her most celebrated novel, but I also have a lot of respect and love for sort of her renewed origin story, which is Alice Walker's sort of discovery and in search of her grave, to place a headstone on it that, you know, kind of reaffirmed, renewed our understanding of Zora Neale Hurston as a genius of the South. And I love so much about that story. Of course, you know, Black women authors recovering and really celebrating one another. It reminds me of the responsibility that I believe that Black women writers have to each other, not just to future and aspiring writers, but to our peers, and of course to those who came before us who could potentially be forgotten if we don't lift them up. I feel especially this way about Zora Neale Hurston, in part because she's another Capricorn like me. Her birthday was recently, and also love the fact that she did so many different kinds of things, that she was an anthropologist, that she was a folklorist, that she was a dramatist. She was really the central figure during the Harlem Renaissance, which my sister reminded me recently. Shout out to Rita, what's up? She reminded me recently that we are going to be in the 100th year anniversary, or you know, the centennial of the Harlem Renaissance, which is an incredible year. You know, to think that Zora Neale Hurston published her first short story in 1921 seems like a long time ago and not that long ago, right? In terms of the way that we think about literary fiction and the way that we think about our literary heroes, and also the way we think about canons and how canons operate, right? So I loved the foreword by Tre Jones, who basically inspires us to consider that we should read some of these aloud, because we can really hear her humor, we can really hear her delivery, her concern with respecting and preserving the language of working class Black folk from the South, from Florida. So, you know, these pages, like their author, contain multitudes. Tre wrote, she said, "I recommend reading this work aloud, enjoying the feel of the words in your mouth and the sound of English tightened and strummed like the strings of a banjo. Lose yourself in these stories. Laugh when it's funny. Wipe your eyes when the spirit moves you. Remember Zora in this way, complicated and brilliant." These pages, like their author, contain multitudes. And that is true. You know, Zora Neale Hurston, in her time between 1920 and 1950, Alice Walker reminds us, was the most prolific Black woman writer in America. And that is particularly noteworthy because she was writing in a time when people just did not respect the stories of Black people, certainly not Black women, not really women at all, actually. So it makes it even that much more notable. What I will say, though, is that I didn't particularly resonate with a lot of these stories. I thought that there were lines that I found really beautiful. There's only one story that I really, really loved, and it's the story called Magnolia Flower, which is like really beautiful. It's like a mixed method painting, right? Like you have allegory and you have this anthropomorphization of rivers and blossoms. There's lines like, let's see, I marked some of them. Before 2 weeks had passed, the teacher had taught the flower to read strange marvels with her dark eyes, and she had taught the teacher to sing with his eyes, his hands, his whole body in her presence, or whenever he thought of her, not in her father's house, but beneath that clump of palms, those three that bathe their toes eternally and talk. They busied themselves with dreams of creation, while Bentley swore the foundation of the schoolroom into place. So really lovely notions like this, the story of the river, the story of the sky. In a story called The Gilded Six Bits, there's a really wonderful, now that I've called it out, of course I won't be able to find it, but there's a really wonderful description of the sun. The sun, the hero of every day, the impersonal old man that beams as brightly on death as on birth, came up every morning and raced across the blue dome and dipped into the sea of fire every evening. Water ran downhill and birds nested. I mean, there's so much in that short span of a page. It's a sentence that, it's two sentences, right? One is very long, the other is quite short. And in that movement, you have a whole world, right? So that's really her gift in these short stories. But I think part of the challenge is, I've been thinking about this quite a lot actually, because I would never want to say anything to diminish her talents as a writer. Because she is actually a genius. But what I would say is that, what's challenging about having your work emerge later, and after you're dead, right, is that you don't have the opportunity to edit it. You don't, the lack of imagination for Black writers and Black women writers in particular in publishing has meant that we have not always had the incredible necessity of being rigorously edited, and also the respect of being edited, right? Because to have your work shaped and looked over and kind of noted and picked apart so that you can revise it rigorously and keep it whole is a luxury. It's a privilege. It's a privilege to be edited. It feels like hell. You don't really want it to happen to you. And at the same time, your work can only become its best when you have editors who care enough to help you shape the story that you're trying to tell. And so in the bulk of these stories, you can see where there's promise. You can see where there's lots of energy, where the characters are really amazing, where there is the beginning of a really strong narrative or a strong narrative arc or really interesting scenes. For instance, there are two stories. One is called The Book of Harlem. The other is called Book of Harlem, but they are in fact different stories. So that's kind of confusing. They're not necessarily that different. And, while we have the really great wisdom of Genevieve West, who edited this collection and writes a pretty lengthy introduction, which I might add is probably a little bit too long, at least for me, because I felt like I wanted to just jump into the stories. I just wanted to read stories, and that I got all this context, which helped, but also kind of annoyed me a little bit, because I felt like, when you're reading a collection of short stories from an author, you don't necessarily want to know all of the backstory related to them. You mostly just want to let the work speak for itself. But of course, because so much time has passed, many different people speak for Zora, or on Zora's behalf. And that doesn't mean that their intentions aren't true. It just means that the way in which a short story should be preserved and absorbed is no longer really an option for these stories, because they come with so much else, so the weight of history, and also the way that the form has morphed and changed over time. So these by and large read to me as being relatively experimental. And of course, the thing with experiments, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. So for me personally, I would give this if I were going to rate it, I would probably give it like 3 stars, 3.5 maybe, because it's Zora near Hurston. And like I said, Magnolia Flower is a really beautiful story. There are some really good lines in each of the stories. There's some really interesting concepts, I think, and some really beautiful work that she does in these pages. But some of it was really hard to follow, and I was really distracted by what I saw as kind of some repetition that was hard to reconcile. Even understanding, allowing for the stylistic differences of the period in which she was writing. So I hope that if you pick it up, you'll let me know what you think. If you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear why in the comments. I'm happy to have a constructive dialogue for people who disagree with me. In fact, really learn a lot when people have different views on a book than I do. But would love to hear your favorites, either in terms of lines or stories, or any other thoughts that you have about the book. But again, the book is Zora near Hurston's Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick. Next up, I have been sort of cheating on my to be read list with Alexander Chee's Queen of the Night, but I am plodding along in Franchise by Marcia Chatelaine, and I'm reading Frankly in Love by David Yoon. I think it is David Yoon. And then I have a couple other things going. Oh, I know what I was going to tell you about. I am reading Robin Crawford's book about Whitney Houston, A Song for You, and I need to read that in doses, but I'm certainly going to do a review of that book because it is wild. There's a lot of information. Oh my goodness. But yeah, so I'm trying to rein myself in and not go too far down the rabbit hole and like add things to the to be read list, because I don't think my nightstand can take it. But that's where I'm going with that. So you will hear from me again soon when I finish one of these many other books. But let me know what you're reading too. And thank you for watching. And thanks again for all your support. I appreciate it so much. You are the best. And I will see you again next time.